One of the other themes that I noticed throughout the book was you're having to write about the loss of military personnel. And I'm wondering, you mentioned a number of them, some people that had been killed in various ways. Was that, as you were writing about it, one of the more difficult parts?
I did my best to mention everyone in my brigade who died. There were 24 of them, and to discuss the circumstances surrounding their deaths and their to show their bravery and their devotion to duty, in which they all, despite the manner in which they all died doing their duty, and many of them exhibiting signs of bravery in the process. It's important for the families, and it's important for the American people to see that these are American citizens standing up, what I call in the final chapter, America's newest, greatest generation, which is willing to stand up for what it believes in and sacrifice in order to achieve it. Probably the most difficult part of the book, though, to write was the 8 pages in the chapter entitled Automia, where I discussed the death of my Sergeant Major Eric Cook, who was a close confidant and a very good friend. We lived right next to each other for 5 months or so leading into the operation in which he was killed. And, I had to come to grips with the mistakes I made that night, and the mistakes others had made, and the manner in which he died. And it was very difficult. It was a very difficult time for the brigade to have one of its senior leaders killed. And so that was by far the hardest part of the book to write. But it was also probably the most cathartic experience in writing the book.
Mm-hmm. Was there a part that flew off the pages really easily? You said that was, maybe the beginning of it when you're talking about your childhood and things like that. Stories that I think a lot of people like to tell.
Actually, that went pretty quick. And then you might think otherwise, but the final chapter, Reflections, also flew off the pen, because I had so many ideas I'd been thinking about for a while that they linked together pretty easily, and that was a pretty easy chapter to write. The part in terms of my family history and my personal history was one of the funnest parts to write. It was trip down memory lane. Many of the experiences were positive, and so it was fun to think back and write about my childhood and whatnot.
How did writing this memoir differ from, say, writing your dissertation, what later became 1999's book, The GI Offensive in Europe, The Triumph of American Infantry Divisions 1941 to 45?
The big difference was the amount of research I had to do to compile the book. The GI Offensive in Europe was an outgrowth of my dissertation, greatly expanded and revised, but it is chocked full of footnotes that document where the sources are from, many of them from archival sources. For Baghdad at Sunrise, most of the sources were close at hand. I either had them in my personal possession, they were in electronic format, they were in my journals, and the rest of the sources in terms of finding out what the media had written that year, for instance, I could get off the internet. So the research for Baghdad at Sunrise was way easier, and that made it a much quicker process. From the time I started researching the GI offensive in Europe in the summer of 1991, it was 8 years before it was published. I started writing Baghdad at Sunrise in 2005, and it was published in 2008, so quicker by half at least.
Now, I'm curious, did you have to forego some of the writing habits you learned in the academy to learn new ones for this kind of book? For example, you include personal details in the book, things about your life, like the Michigan-Ohio State game, that were not in the other one. It was a different kind of writing, more memoir.
Exactly. It's hard for me, a historian who writes prose that's chocked full of footnotes and a very academic style, if you will. I had to really work hard to force myself to put in personal stories and talk about feelings and talk about what people looked like and all the standard tradecraft for a fiction writer, which is not standard for a nonfiction writer. And I think I succeeded somewhat in that regard, but I can get much better, but it doesn't come naturally to me.
Okay.
You know, at some point, I'd love to write historical fiction, for instance, but to do it, I'd have to really revamp my writing style and be able to put in those kind of details.
What are you hoping, or what do you imagine that military historians will get out of your book? How will they regard it? What are your hopes for it? What do you...
If you look back on, say, the history of the U.S.-Philippine War at the turn of the 20th century, there was it had kind of the same progression of memoirs that came out of that conflict. First, the guys like Commodore Dewey, you know, right, the big guys, they write their memoirs. And then you have some of the really lower level guys, the soldiers and the officers at the very lowest levels writing their accounts. And that middle tier, the middle managers, the middle leaders of the war, in this case brigade combat team commanders, back in that case perhaps the same rank colonels who were in charge of various units. It took a while for those kind of memoirs to come out, but once they did, they filled a really key gap in the history of the war. From, you know, there I was in the jungles and it was hot and it was humid and, you know, the Moros were a vicious enemy, to Commodore Dewey saying, yes, I sailed into Manila Bay, sunk the Spanish fleet, conquered, and went home. But in between are the folks that really shaped the war effort. And this, Baghdad at Sunrise, is the first book that is part of that middle tier. Not there I was on the streets of Baghdad and it was hot and dusty and the people spoke a strange language, or the upper tier, Jerry Bremer's My Year in Iraq, and Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez memoirs and those. But this is the first one at the brigade combat team level that says, here's what the strategy was, here's how it was implemented through folks above me and the orders I received, here's what it was like on the streets, and this is how I tried to bring it all together. And I think it's a really crucial piece of the war, history of the war, that you know, will be amplified hopefully by other books in the future.
Okay. Given the long and complicated history of the region around Iraq, how did you balance the historical background with your storytelling? I mean, when you're going through this book, there are moments where you'll take a couple of paragraphs or something to describe, you know, this is the background of this this religious conflict, this is a background of that, this is and a lot of, I was learning a lot of stuff about the area, the Sunni-Shiite split, things like that. What I suspect that area holds immense personal and professional fascination for you. It must have been tempting to hold back details. How did you deal with that?
Well, not really. You know, I am half Palestinian, so Ana Housley min Ramallah. My family is from Ramallah in the West Bank, and I wanted to present that history, the history of how my family came over to the United States, which is really interesting. But I didn't want to just lump it into one section. And the same with Iraqi history and Islamic history. It's really important to understand it, to understand the background of the conflict. But I just want to take a chapter and say, okay, here's all the antecedents to what was going on. Mm-hmm. So what I decided to do to make the book more readable and more enjoyable is to break up both the family history, the Iraqi history, the Islamic history, into manageable chunks and insert it into the manuscript where it made sense to do so. So if we're talking about the pilgrimage to Karbala on a Shiite holiday, then I would backtrack and talk about, well, why does this holiday exist? Let's talk about the Battle of Karbala in the 7th century A.D. and talk about, you know, the Sunni-Shiite split at that point. And, you know, those were the kind of things that I'd interject, which I think makes the text more readable. Mm-hmm. And so every now and then you get a little detail of Iraqi history, Islamic history that lends itself to the background of what's going on and understanding why things happen the way they're happening.